Cultured fermentation versus wild fermentation. What's the difference? Cultured fermentation. In regards to fermentation, a culture is the deliberate growing or development of specific microbes. For example, specific yeast species are cultivated for winemaking, specific bacteria are cultivated for yogurt making, or specific molds are cultivated for tempeh making. A starter culture is used at the beginning of a fermentation. It is deliberately added to the food or beverage source in order to initiate and inoculate the fermentation with the desired microbes contained in the culture. The strains of microbes in a starter culture are often specifically selected to cause the food or beverage to develop intentional flavors and/or textures. The winemaking industry is a great example of this. Winemakers will use specific cultivated yeast organisms to develop intentional flavors that they want the wine to have. Most modern, large-scale producers of fermented foods and beverages also need consistent product quality and predictable production schedules, as well as stringent quality control to ensure food safety. Therefore, most large-scale or commercial-level producers will use starter cultures because they can provide these reliable, consistent results. To sum up, the predominant benefits of using starter cultures for fermentations are their ability to be controlled, they're reliable, and safe. Wild fermentation. Wild fermentation depends on the naturally occurring microbes found already present on or in the food. The food picks them up from the soil they were grown in, or the tree that they were grown on, the plant, the bush, etc. Many of these beneficial wild microbes are also naturally present in the air all around us. We breathe them daily. If the conditions are right, these naturally present microbes can initiate the spontaneous fermentation of foods. When done correctly, the wild fermentation of vegetables, vinegars, and wines is very safe. It's been a method of food preparation and preservation for literally thousands of years. A classic example of wild fermentation is homemade sauerkraut. The needed microbes that ferment the cabbage are naturally present on the leaves. Favorable conditions are created by adding a salt brine to the packed cabbage in the jar, and voila! The wild microbes get to work. In a matter of days, you have a spontaneous wild fermentation that will turn cabbage into kraut. Homemade apple cider vinegar is also a great example of a wild fermentation. Again, with the right conditions created, in this case warmth, sugar, and water, the yeast naturally present on the apples will spontaneously initiate fermentation without any starter culture added. Further along in the fermentation, a bacteria called Acetobacter will begin making their contribution to the process. These acetobacters are naturally present in the air all around us. Again, without human aid, they find their way into the apple water, inoculate it, and work synergistically with the wild yeast that got things going in the first place. And voila, vinegar is the end result, naturally and wild. However, wild microorganisms are not uniformly the same like with cultured microorganisms. That's why sauerkrauts and vinegars can have different flavors depending on where they were made. This applies to all wild fermentations. The unique flavors of the fermentations generated from wild microbes are not only free to use, accessible to everyone, but make interesting and delicious fermentations that a starter culture developed in a laboratory can't duplicate. This kind of different is often fun and exciting, but for a manufacturer who needs stringent consistency, will most likely opt for a cultured fermentation instead of a wild fermentation. Another note worth mentioning regarding wild fermentation is that wild microbes are hardier than laboratory cultured microbes. Since wild microbes come from the outdoor soil, they are born to be fighters. Survival of the fittest, you may say. And if they want to live and proliferate, they must compete with or go as far as outcompete the other microbes they share space with. Plus, wild microbes are exposed to varying environmental temperatures that force them to be adaptable. These microbe qualities result in hardier fermentations. Cultured microbes, on the other hand, are born into an environment that is intentionally created by humans to be perfect for their development. Essentially, they have no competition. nor need to adapt to varying environments. A humorous way of looking at it is, if you put a wild microbe in a boxing ring with a cultured microbe, the cultured microbe would be knocked out with the first punch in the first round. But like I said, there is a place for each depending on what you're fermenting and what the intentions of the fermentation are. As for me, I always go wild with vegetable and vinegar fermentations, and culture only when wild is either not going to be reliable or if wild could pose a risk, such as with yogurt making. I've mentioned a lot of fermented foods in this video, such as sauerkraut, wine, and vinegar. And although they may all be fermented foods, they're not all the same type of fermentation. Each type of fermentation is unique. Check out my video on the 5 different types of fermentation to learn more right here. And this playlist here contains delicious fermentation recipes, including sauerkraut, vinegar, and pickles. I'll see you in the next video where we're going to ferment beans. Not this kind of bean, that kind of bean. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.